Okay, can we move into the world of publishing now?
Hmm.
So, just for from your perspective, having worked in the industry and advice for emerging writers or authors who are looking at pitching to publishers. First question, in terms of the landscape here in Australia is vastly different, say, in the US, in terms
Mhm.
of the requirement to have an agent. Can you just explain that in terms of is it a necessity to have an agent in Australia?
No, actually, Australia is one of the very few places in the world where it's not at all necessary. Depending on who you are as a writer and what it is that you're particularly looking for, you might really like an agent. Um, they can move you up submission piles a little faster. They can certainly take care of a lot of the business of being a writer. And if you're somebody who just wants to write, having an agent can be really useful because they can navigate the contracts and any negotiations. If you're somebody who feels that you might not feel confident advocating for yourself in conversations with the publisher, an agent can be really useful for that as well. But in terms of getting yourself published in the first place, an agent can help, but it's really not necessary. Most of the publishers here in Australia that take local submissions have a lot of different mechanisms to have contact directly with authors, whether it's through an open submission portal, whether it's through active participation in pitching days through the Australian Society of Authors or through your writers centers, writers festivals. Lots of conferences have lots of pitching days. There's a lot of publishers that have a specific day when their submissions pile is open. Pan Mac used to do it on Friday. I think Alan and Unwin does it on the first Monday of every month. But there's a lot of different ways of getting into getting your work seen by somebody in the industry without the use of an agent. Submitting for prizes is a really good way of doing that. They're often judged by publishers or people within the agency, within the industry. You have a lot of ways and a lot of avenues and a lot of access to the publishing industry in a way that's just not true in the US and the UK. So get one if you think that it's going to work for you, but don't feel that you have to have one.
Why is it different between here and the US, for example? Is it just because of the sheer number of agents and publishing houses in the US compared to Australia?
Yeah, I think that might be it. There's just so many people in the US, and the industry is significantly larger there. So it's a lot easier, I think, to be completely overwhelmed. I think in many ways, it's just the way that it's set up. And there are certain attitudes, I think, as well. Australia prides itself to a large extent on being a reasonably flat hierarchy in terms of structure. So Australia, I think, would pride itself on not hiding away in big office buildings and never actually talking to authors. So.
That leads me to my next question for authors who are looking at pitching to publishers or agents. As far as what would be your sort of top picks regarding what are the key ingredients for a successful submission? So if anyone has been through that process, typically you've got I mean, the one thing I'm finding is that they've all got different requirements. So some require different word counts for different types. So you got to rewrite your synopsis 500, 300, 1,000, 800 words. So you've got to have different versions of your synopsis depending on the requirements. A bio, cover letter. Some are after a sample of your manuscript in various formats. Clearly, you have to comply with their specific requirements. That's the obvious number one. Comply with their requirements. But beyond that, from your experience working publishing, what do you think helps people get noticed in the slush pile?
So you're quite right in the sense that you absolutely have to make sure that you've tailored your application to whoever it is that you're pitching to. And for the guidelines for the submission guidelines are there often for very, very good reasons in terms of what programs get used or how they get filtered through into the different editors or publishers that might want to look at your work. They're also there to make sure that you've been paying attention. In Publishers and commissioning editors are absolutely inundated by work, and we're always looking for a reason to say no, because if we say no, then it's something we don't have to deal with. We can get it off our desk. And having a submission that came in the wrong format or that hasn't paid any attention to our word count limits is a really good, easy way to say no. It's just something that we don't have to think about anymore. So do follow the publishing guidelines, because it's a really easy way to set yourself apart from a lot of the other submissions that your commissioning editor is going to be looking at on the day. A submission package normally comes in 3 parts. So you have your synopsis, which can be anywhere between 500 to 1,000 words. The most important thing about your synopsis is it's not a time to be coy. You absolutely have to give away the twists and the spoilers and everything. It should be a very faithful account of what happens in your story. And the reason for that is because we'll often read your sample, and if we like your writing, if the story starts well, if we're engaged, we will flip to the synopsis and look through the rest of it. And we're looking for things like a well thought out plot, a conflict that's been well developed, and really importantly, depending on the book that we're looking at, we're making sure that it complies with the genre conventions that we're looking for. So I can't tell you how many people submitted to me when I was at Escape, and Escape had a very clear mandate. We were publishing romance fiction, and I could only publish romance fiction. I didn't have the scope in the imprint to publish anything else. It had to be romance. And I would get these submissions all the time that said something like, oh, I know you only publish romance, but I promise if you read my book, you're going to love it and you're going to publish it. Which is patently untrue. Not because I might love your book. It might be the best book I've ever read, but I have a job, and my job is to publish romance fiction. I can't publish your not romance fiction at my job. So a synopsis is a really good way of making sure that we're not wasting our time reading a book that decides that actually a sad ending is 100%
everyone dies.
Yeah, exactly. 100% exactly right. So that's the reason for the synopsis. So you have a synopsis, you have your sample, right? Your sample chapters. And again, that will be like the first 3 chapters or the first 50 pages or the first, 10,000 words. Again, it'll depend on the publisher. If it is a word count or pages, you are allowed to end your section. So don't worry if it's 10,020 words, if you don't want to stop in the middle of a sentence, but it's there also because everybody's very time poor. And one of the most important things is your cover letter, and people often dismiss it as not being a crucial part of your submissions package, but you should think about your cover letter for your book the same way you think about your cover letter for an application. Your CV is all well and good, but your cover letter is what's going to tell me about who you are as a person. It's going to introduce me to your style of writing. It's going to take some of the niceties off, which is going to start the relationship in the right place if you've done some homework and know who you're submitting to. So it has my name on it. It tells me why you're submitting to me or to the publishing house that I work for. So I know that you're not just blanket submitting, or at least it appears as if you're not just blanket submitting. It talks about where you want to be in the industry. It gives me an idea of whether or not you're tapped into what's happening in your genre. So it's a really personal document that can tell me a lot about who you are, and also tell me if I'm going to want to work with you as an author, not just with the work that you've produced. So I would spend a lot of time on your cover.
I think I've lost you both.
What happened?
I just
What
got bumped out.
happened?
Yeah, I thought it was your internet, but clearly it was mine. So I missed. So we're back in, and looks like we're still recording. So
that's a good thing.
yeah. So I'm just thinking where you were talking about where it kind of froze. So I'm just thinking where we can continue on, so I can just edit that part out. Could you just go back a little bit, Kate? Sorry, I probably missed about 30 seconds of what you were just talking about.
Do you remember what I said last?
I was listening avidly, but
Because I did go on a bit, so I'm not. I
no,
just
not
want to
at
make sure
all.
that I'm not. Not
It
just
was about submissions and
It was about the cover letter,
the cover
talking
letter,
about.
making sure cover letter is the key to a submission.
Yeah. Do you want me to just go over the cover letter again?
Yes,
Go
thanks.
for it.
Okay. And then the third part is your cover letter. And a lot of people rush the cover letter. They dismiss it as not as important as the synopsis or the sample chapters. It's in fact more important. The synopsis will tell me about your story. The chapters will tell me about your writing, but your cover letter tells me about who you are. And it's a real opportunity to introduce yourself, to show me that you've done some homework. So if it's addressed to me, for example, or if you're speaking to why you want to submit to me in particular or my publishing house, with examples of why you think that this would be a really collaborative relationship. It also allows me to glean some information about how tapped in you are to the genre that you're writing in, how aware you are of what's happening in that kind of story space at the moment. It gives me an indication, I think, of whether I want to work with you as an author and not just with your story, which is a really great place to start the kind of collaborative relationship that you're hoping for between a writer and their publisher. So spend some time on your cover letter. It's really important.
Cool.
Just a question about editing. Clearly, when submitting, you want it to be as clean as possible. You want it to be your best product as possible. But my question is around to what extent should authors, when submitting, invest in editors? The reason why I asked that question is that I was at a writers' conference and there was a representative of a publishing house who made the comment that they would prefer that when people are submitting their manuscripts, that they haven't yet worked with a professional editor, because if they were to sign them, that they could work with the author and kind of mold the manuscript to the way they want it. So versus, some might say, no, you should invest in editors and get it ship shape as professional as you possibly can prior to submitting. What are your thoughts on editing?
Well, I mean, that's part of what a publishing house can bring to your relationship, is working with an editor to shape and mold your story. I think as a writer, if you think that you could benefit from working with an editor prior to submitting, if you think it's something that you could learn something from, if it would be helpful for your creative development, if you're stuck with something and you feel like you could use some outside help, then I think that all of that are very valid reasons to enlist an editor to help you with. If you're hoping to be trade published, then that's something that that your trade publisher brings to the table. It's also something we're really good at looking around. The people who are commissioning really know how to look at the scaffolding of a story and not the window dressing. So we can see the bones of it and know if the bones are there, and also know, what can be tidied up, what can be tightened, what can be fixed, what we'd like to talk about with the author in terms of other aspects of the story as well. So I would say, unless you have a really solid reason for doing it, I wouldn't waste your money. The other thing to think about as well is that the editors that you work with at publishing houses are people who are really highly trained, they're really highly experienced, they know what they're doing when working with this kind of work. And you might not always get that from somebody that you hire yourself. There's no real barrier to calling yourself an editor, even if you're not necessarily trained or experienced. And certainly when it comes, just like I think with every job, there are editors who specialize in specific kinds of writing or who have a lot of skill in particular kinds of writing and not necessarily in others. There are aptitudes, and you, as an author, you might not be able to get the information you need about the editors that you're thinking about working with and determine if that's actually an editor that is going to help you with your particular story, or whether there's somebody who, could just do a very competent copy edit as opposed to as opposed to the higher level developmental or structural editing that might be the most useful thing that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. I've had experience working with editors doing manuscript assessments. I've had 2 manuscript assessments now for 2 different novels, and I definitely found that me at the very early stage, I would recommend that. Again, it comes down to your budget. It's gonna cost you, but that's where the editors will take a really broad view of your novel. For example, one editor said to me, in my book, which had a lot of historical backstory at the beginning, she said, you need to start this story at the action. Start the story when the train is about to lose control down the hill. And so I had, 15 pages of beautiful prose describing describing the setting in 1947 and all historical information. But start from the action. So things like that
Yeah.
that I found, and that really helped tighten up the manuscript. So yeah, so there's different types of editing as well, isn't there?
I mean, that's the moment of transition. You should always start your novel at the moment of transition. I think there's a desire for authors, for their readers to know all of the things that were in place before the action started, as a way of knowing the characters better or having a deeper understanding of why this change is such a big deal. Readers mostly don't need that. You need it as, like, authors need to know so much more about the world that you're creating and the story and the characters than readers ever need to know. So a lot of times you might find that you need that kind of writing in order to write yourself into the story, to figure out where it is that you are going. But it's often not necessary when it comes to actually writing the story that you want to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a really good piece of advice.
Yeah. You spoke before about what are the key ingredients to a good submission. What about the practicalities of publishers receiving sheer volumes of submissions? Is there an element of good timing, good luck in terms of who's at the desk at the time, who's receiving the manuscripts, timing in terms of trends in the industry? We talked before about oversaturation of a particular genre that suddenly publishers are not looking at particular, so you've kind of missed the boat with your particular genre. Yeah, there must be so many variables that come into what are the manuscripts that get identified out of the slush pile.
Look, people don't like to talk about it, but an enormous amount of luck is required at every step of the process, from getting your manuscript noticed to selling books at the end. Luck really comes into it to a large extent. When it comes to getting your book seen by the right person, first of all, if you're listening to a podcast like this and actively thinking about your craft, then you're already in the top 2% of the kinds of submissions that we see come through the submissions pile.
Wow.
So much comes through where somebody's just dashed off some thoughts and they just submit it. They haven't ever thought about anything. Because I accepted science fiction romance at Escape, I used to receive a lot more science fiction than anybody else was receiving in the industry. And I would receive so many submissions that said something like, this is going to revolutionize science fiction, by somebody who had read like Ender's Game and hadn't read science fiction since. And nothing is going to revolutionize anything. There's 9 stories. It's never about completely revolutionizing anything. It's about knowing where there's space in your genre to tell a new kind of story or a new kind of point of view. So I don't think, just be aware that if you're working at it, then you're already light years ahead of much of the stuff that we see come through the submissions file. And then if you're following your submissions guidelines, then you're like in the 1% of the kinds of submissions that we see come through the submissions pile. In most publishing houses, the people who are reading the submissions pile have a really good idea of what the different publishers and commissioning editors like. So even if they don't necessarily like the story, again, remember that we're really good at telling if the bones of the story are good. And we're also really good at recognizing that this might not be our kind of story, but it doesn't mean that it's not a good story. And we're also really good at knowing the tastes and the points of view of the other people in the publishing house. So even if it doesn't necessarily get read initially by the person who will publish your story, that's going to be read by a person who knows the other publishers, and they'll be able to say, this isn't for me. I think this might be for you. What do you think? And we tend to pass manuscripts that we think are of good quality back and forth, to find the right person to take them on and then champion it. So that's not necessarily as much of a problem as things like that. And this is where the luck comes in. A publishing house might have enough crime novels for the minute, and you don't want to start cannibalizing your sales. You want to make sure that when it comes to marketing and PR, the authors have enough opportunity to get reviews, to get the podcast interviews, to get the opportunity to talk on festival stages. So it might simply be that you've written a great crime novel, but there's no space on the publisher's list for more crime. It might be that you've written a really good novel that is really close or has a very strong element that has just been picked up by another book. So that's just bad luck as well. It might be, as you say, that the trends are shifting a little bit, and we don't necessarily think that there's going to be space in the market for this particular book. But this is a really good time for you to remember that the one thing that you should always be doing as writers is writing your next book, because it might be that there's no space for this rural crime book that you've written. But if I like your writing and if I like your story, then my first question to you is going to be, what else do you have? So if you have, even if it's not finished or if it's not polished, if you're able to say, okay, well, if you don't want real crime, what about this? I have this, or I've also have this idea for this. What do you think about this? And that, that's a really warm place to start the submission process from. So always be writing your next book, because it might not be this book that gets you noticed, but it might be your writing, and then the publisher is interested in what else you have sitting, either resting in your desk drawer, or that's the current project that you're working on as well.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And for authors who are lucky enough to be offered a publishing deal, I know there's a lot of stuff here that we probably don't have time to go through in a lot of detail, but generally speaking, in terms of people's expectations around how a publishing house can assist with distribution, getting your books out into bookstores, and obviously it might depend on how big the publishing house is and what distributor they're working with, as far as how wide your books are going to be distributed onto bookstores, as well as the proactive marketing that the publisher will do for you versus the self-generated marketing that all authors need to do. So I know it's a very big question and trying for you to dissect that, but what would be some tips as far as realistic expectations for an author who is offered a contract with a reasonably sized publishing house? What could they expect as far as the distribution, or what are some of the, perhaps the best way to reframe it is, what might be some of the limitations around marketing and distribution that publishing house might be able to offer?
So when it comes to distribution, the vast majority of the publishing houses that work in Australia have the same access to the same distribution, because there's very few distribution companies, and most of us pay for the same warehousing and the same distribution. It's at the bookseller end. There's a misconception that the publishers decide where to distribute your book. It's more about what books the booksellers decide to buy in. And part of the sales process is sending our sales teams out to the different booksellers and pitching our books. So authors start at the beginning and pitch your work to us as a publishing house. And then the publishing house takes on, and basically everybody is always pitching all the time. It's just that you pitch at the beginning, and then your publisher will pitch to the acquisitions team to try and get your book across the line and get it a contract. And then your sales team will start pitching it to the booksellers. Your marketing team will be pitching it to point of sales offers and other kind of opportunities. Your PR team will be pitching it to festivals and to podcasts and I don't know, news radio or breakfast TV, depending on the kind of book that you've written. And then, of course, the booksellers at the end of the day are pitching it to the readers. So publishing is really just a chain of people pitching your book from beginning to end. So when it comes to distribution, it's really about whether the booksellers can see the potential in your book, and they often know their market reasonably well. So obviously there's the big DDSs, so Big W, Kmart, and Target. Kmart and Target are not a player in this field anymore. They really only take brands. They don't take books. Big W still takes a lot of Australian fiction and nonfiction, and still is very open to hearing about debuts and mid-list authors. So Big W is definitely a big player in the book sales field still. Kmart and Target, not as much. And then you have the chains like Dymocks and QBD, who might either buy as a group, in the sense that every Dymocks in Australia will have copies of your book, or different individual Dymocks will buy in your book based on their market and whether they think that their market is going to be particularly interested in the book that you've written. And then, of course, the independents tend to buy based on their market as well. And most of the publishers will have sales reps in every market, so it's often state by state, and they're going to be pitching into their market with the cover and with the story, and the booksellers will be making decisions based on whether they think that your book is going to sell or not. So when it comes to distribution, it's a lot about how big the sales force of your publisher is, and what kind of territories that they're pitching into, what kind of work that they can do for that sort of thing as well. But a lot of it is about how wide of interest your book might have within the readership, what kind of genre it is, what kind of story it is. A lot of that will play into what kind of distribution your book will see. There are a lot of books that, returning to our conversation about literary fiction, for example, that tends to be something that independent bookstores are really interested in, but the DDSs aren't. When it comes to things like crime fiction, the DDSs do tend to be interested, and the chains, the independents, maybe not so much. So it really depends on the kind of book as to how widespread distribution you might see from it. When it comes to marketing, you're quite right in the sense that authors have to take on a lot of the marketing themselves. Although realistically, authors are marketing themselves as brands, and your publisher is marketing your book. And the biggest thing that I think writers should know is that the vast majority of the most effective marketing that is done at point of sale. So it's really cool to see your book on the side of your bus, on a bus, for example, or like in those light boxes in shopping centers. That's not particularly effective as a marketing tool. What is really effective is paying for a space on the new release table when you walk into an independent bookstore, or paying for space for your book to appear in the QBD Christmas catalog, for example, or paying for it to appear at the If You Like scroll at the bottom of your digital bookseller. All of those are paid places. If you're on end cap of Big W, it's because your publisher is paid for that. And that's the kind of marketing that is actually incredibly effective in terms of turning visibility of your book into actual sales. And that's where the marketing spend often gets spent from publishing houses. Putting it on a bus, it would mostly just be a waste of money. And honestly, the kinds of books that you see on buses tend to be really big brands anyway. And it would be somebody who's going to go and buy that book and just needs to know that there's a new one out. Yeah. They're not actually people who are down sort of here scrabbling for visibility in the industry. So so the biggest thing I think about marketing, this misconception, is that if we haven't put your book on a bus, it's because we don't care about it. And the reality is, no, we're actually putting all of that marketing spend where we know that it's actually going to make a huge difference. And that really is at point of sale. And it's not very sexy and it's not very exciting, but that's where it has the best chance of being successful.
That's a good point for an indie author to know, that's where to spend the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, indie authors have so much more opportunity at that kind of point of sale with Apple, with Amazon, with Kobo, those kinds of places, um, because sorry, this is going to be incredibly mercenary, but the point of the digital point of sales make more money off of your books than they do off trade published books. So they're more invested in your book selling. So they offer you things like price discounts or flexibility, or I don't even know, scrolls and banners and that sort of thing that we never get to see. We don't ever have the opportunity to take those on, but they want independent authors to succeed, because the more books that you sell, the more money they make. So absolutely take advantage of the kinds of opportunities that the digi point of sale booksellers offer you.
Fantastic. I will. That's next year's project.
And what would happen if you've got your book with a traditional publisher, good distribution, but then your books don't sell? Some authors might be thinking, hey, once I'm signed, I've made it. I'm on the A list. Books are out there. I'll sit back and watch the dollars roll in and I'll become a bestseller. But clearly, with so much competition, there are a lot of books that just don't sell. And there might be bookstore returns, or maybe publishers might say, hey, we're not going to do another print run. We're done. We're not going to publish print anymore. Can happen?
It can, and it's really heartbreaking. If you're want to be a writer, there's a really, really good book by a writer named Peter Ball, and it's called You Don't Want to Be Published. And it's basically about how getting published isn't the last step, it's the first step. And honestly, getting published is probably the easiest part of having a career as an author, because everything afterwards, it actually gets a little bit trickier. So I would really strongly recommend you look at that. It's full of amazing advice, and Peter is just such an incredible mind in this space. But yeah, that can absolutely happen, and it's really sad. And you can have a book that gets sold in really well. So all sorts of booksellers are really interested. They take thousands of copies. You think this is going to be fantastic, and then it just doesn't hit the market. And nobody ever really knows why or how or what's happening. Maybe the cover wasn't quite right, or it just wasn't the right time, or I don't know. There's a new Netflix special that everybody's watching instead. This is again where that aspect of luck comes in. The trickiest part for that is not that your publisher doesn't want to see what you do next. It's that if a bookseller has taken your book and then had to return it, they often don't want to take your book into their space again. Booksellers have very limited space on their bookshelves, and they try and hold it for the books that they know are actually going to move. You might be able to convince them to take a copy or two, but you won't necessarily get that huge investment that you might have gotten with a first book. And the hand selling might be harder, but your publisher will often try and tell a new story about your book. So we know the first one didn't sell, but this one's really personal, and the author's going to talk about, I don't know, their experience with deep sea submarines. I'm just making this up off the top of my head now. They'll try and spin and find a new angle for why this book will be different and this book is going to hit the market, but it becomes a much harder pitch the second time around if the first book hasn't sold. It's not a hopeless case, but it does become a little bit harder.